I'm Dr. Nick Sutton, and I'm in the library here at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, which is on Magdalen Street in the centre of Oxford. Today we're talking about the Hindu social system, and particularly focusing on the caste divisions in India, and also at gender distinctions, issues of gender in relation to Hindu teachings. What I want to look at, first of all, really is a question to ask, which is the extent to which the caste system is a part of the Hindu religion, or the extent to which it should be regarded as a social and perhaps a cultural phenomenon. This is a debate that is ongoing amongst academics and non-academics alike. Many Hindus today will argue forcefully that caste is not a part of their religion, that it is in fact purely a cultural phenomenon of India. This was the argument put forward by Dayanand Saraswati, the founder of the Arya Samaj, that caste was simply a convenient social system, but it wasn't any part of religious belief at all. We haven't got too long to dwell on that, but I'll make a few points, I think. Firstly, I think caste does exist beyond its strictly religious context, and for many people caste is functional. It works because it's required within a context within rural India, and I would say that particularly in India there are the welfare state doesn't exist in the way that it probably does certainly in Western Europe. I'm not sure about the United States, but in Western Europe, here in Britain, for example, if we're ill, if we're unemployed, if we need care for the elderly, we would typically look to the state to make that sort of provision. State provision of that type doesn't exist in India, and therefore individuals who are in a position of vulnerability would naturally look to their caste for support and protection, and therefore caste is very, very functional. People need their caste for a variety of different purposes, and in that sense it's got nothing at all to do with religion. I think this is exemplified by the fact that it's not just Hindus who divide themselves into different castes. It's well known that the Christians of South India are divided along caste lines. Anybody who's read Arundhati Roy's novel, The God of Small Things, will know how well she illustrates the rigid practice of caste among South Indian Christians, but also Muslims and Sikhs who have no religious commitment at all to the institution of caste also do divide themselves along caste lines, which again suggests that this is primarily a phenomenon of South Asian culture, South Asian society, rather than it being a religious tradition. And indeed, where Hindus have moved beyond the South Asian context and have set up communities in Europe or in North America, then the role of caste rapidly diminishes. The prominence of caste in their lives and identity rapidly diminishes, which again suggests that it's not really a religious phenomenon, not primarily a religious phenomenon. However, there is a debate here, because from the other side it can be argued, and it should be noted, that that Hindu religious teachings do provide an ideological basis for the rigid stratification of society into different groups. And I'll give four, I think, principal arguments which can support this other side of the debate, and I'm not going to attempt to offer any conclusion. I think there's validity on both sides, that it's a social phenomenon and it also it does have a religious basis. First of all, I'm not taking these in any particular order of precedence, but just in the order that they occur, but I would refer to the notion of ritual purity within the practice of Hindu rituals, and this would apply particularly to the Brahmins who enact the rituals on behalf of the community. There is a requirement that the individuals performing the rituals keep themselves in a state of ritual purity, and that means that they dissociate themselves from any source of potential impurity, and a source of potential impurity would be the lower castes, and particularly those whose typical occupation is to do with bodily fluids. Barbers, masseurs, leather workers, butchers, hunters, those people whose activities are likely to put them into a state of impurity. The tendency would be that for the Brahmins to dissociate themselves from such persons, and to divide society along the lines of purity and impurity, particularly where it comes to, for example, taking water from a well, or interdining, curious word that exists really only in the Indian context, who will practice interdining with whom, or having people into the house. So I think ritual purity, which is related to the practice of the religion, is a factor in the stratification of society, and it's clearly related to the practice of religion. Secondly, and perhaps this might be the most important reason, is the fact that the division of society into four principal classes, which many people would regard as the origin of the caste system, is prescribed in Hindu sacred text. The four varnas, the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas and Shudras, that division, that fourfold division of society, is referred to frequently in Hindu sacred texts. Not so much in the Vedic text. I think there's only one reference in the Rig Veda Samhita, in the Purusha Sukta prayer in verse 10. But certainly when we get onto the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Puranas, the Dharma Shastras, etc., important Hindu texts, it is frequently, there are frequent references made to this fourfold division of society as being the ideal method of social stratification. So in that sense, caste, or varna at least, the fourfold division, is advocated and legitimated by Hindu texts. In the Bhagavad Gita, I think chapter 4 verse 13, Krishna says Chatur Varnyam Maya Srishtam, which means the four varnas, the system of four varnas, was created by me. I created this system. It is a divinely ordained institution. So because of that, again, because the fourfold division, which of course is still different from the modern caste system but is related to it, because that is prescribed in Hindu sacred texts, again we could argue that the caste system does have a religious basis to it. And so that would be the second point I would make. There would be references in sacred text. The third point, and again this is based on, to a certain extent, on the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, dharma is a notoriously difficult word to translate, and there are many different translations given, such as religious duty, right action, law, etc. It really means the right way to conduct oneself. Doing the right thing is dharma, and there are different interpretations of dharma, and there are indeed tensions over dharma, as we see particularly in the Mahabharata, the intense debates over what is dharma, and different contributors stating different ideas. But one of the definitions of dharma that is emphasized in the Mahabharata and in the Bhagavad Gita and elsewhere is dharma based on varna. So if you are a Brahmin, your duty is as a Brahmin. If you are of a Kshatriya community, you act as a Kshatriya, etc. So in other words, dharma, religious duty, is defined in terms of the social class into which one is born. Again, others will argue that your social class is defined by your qualities and your natural actions, but overwhelmingly your varna is set in accordance with your birth, and your varna, the social class into which you are born, dictates what is your dharma, what is your religious duty. So again, the concept of dharma, or at least one interpretation, and by no means the only interpretation of what dharma is, but one important interpretation of the nature of dharma, is based on the stratification of society into these four principal divisions, which, although not identical, is related to the contemporary caste system. Okay, and the fourth argument, I think, which is worth noting, which relates caste to religion, is the doctrine of karma. Now, frequently the caste system is criticised by outsiders and insiders alike as being iniquitous and unfair, because it is based on birth alone. In other words, you can't, regardless of what sort of person you are, you can't change your caste identity. However, within religious understanding, the Hindu religious understanding, your birth is not a random event. Your birth is dictated by your previous actions. This is the doctrine of karma. So if you're born in the lowest castes, you can't say necessarily this is unfair, because your birth in that particular social grouping is a result of the activities you performed in your previous life. So although karma isn't directly related to the caste division, it does give a legitimacy and an explanation for it, that different people are born different. We are not all born equal, because the previous activities we performed, the previous consciousness that we developed by our past activities, is transferred over into this life, and on this basis, the basis of our karma, we take birth in a particular social grouping. So overall, I think there are arguments both for and against, and I suppose if I was to be pressed on this and asked for a conclusion, I would say that caste is primarily a social and cultural phenomenon, and the reason why caste persists and exists in India is because of social, economic and cultural reasons. It is not primarily a religious institution. However, religion plays an important role in the caste division, in the caste system, because it provides a degree of legitimacy to it. It provides a religiously based explanation of why this system exists and why it should be sustained. So I think I would try and sum it up in those terms primarily. Okay, moving swiftly on, let's look at the other facet of Indian Hindu society, which has received a great deal of attention in the modern era, and that is the position of Hindu women. And I know, again, from students writing essays on this subject, modern young people particularly regard Hindu teachings on gender as particularly oppressive towards women, and there's a number of books on the subject. We will find it's a popular subject these days: religion and gender, women in religion, and most of these books have a chapter on Hinduism, and if you read these chapters, for the most part they focus on quotations from texts such as the Bhagavad Gita. Sorry, not the Bhagavad Gita, but the Manu Smriti. The Manu Smriti in particular does give guidance about how a woman should exist in society. We've got some quotations from it in the course as well. But basically, what it argues there is that a woman should take a subordinate role to a man. It prescribes things like child marriage, says a woman should regard even an unfaithful husband as a god, widows should not remarry. It said there's a whole set of prescriptions which make up the duties of a woman, the religious duties of a woman, the Stri Dharma, which it would to the modern mind appear to be particularly oppressive, and to relegate a woman to a position of constitutional inferiority to men. I think there's little argument on that point. And then again, people would look at the Ramayana, look at the role of Sita, the way she's banished by Ram, etc. Look at perhaps the female characters within the epics and other literature, and see that they are not given generally an equal status to men. Even in the Bhagavad Gita, there's a verse which I think chapter 9 verse 32 says, Mam hi parta vyapasritya yepi stuhu papayonia hastrio boishas tata shudras tepiyanti paramgatim. Basically what Krishna's arguing there is that anybody who follows the path of devotion can achieve moksha. He says even people whose birth is sinful, papayonia. Then he qualifies that by saying as women are of a lower sinful birth, papayoni. So in the end, it's inherently presumed, therefore, that a female birth is less welcome than a male birth. That to be a man is better than a woman, and there are many prescriptions as well. The dowry system, for example, prescribed in Manu and elsewhere, means that for a girl to be married, her parents would have to give away a sum of money or extensive gifts. And again, that means that generally daughters are less welcome in Hindu families than the birth of sons. I was reading some shocking statistics from the present day even. I think there's a clinic in Bombay where abortions are carried out, and I think they found that of the 800 fetuses aborted, I think something like 790 were female abortions rather than male, because there is that desire for male offspring rather than female, and part of the reason for that is the dowry system, which means that a large number of daughters can be financially challenging, shall we say. So the traditional Hindu system, and particularly the Hindu texts, provide evidence that the Hindu teaching does not allow equality for women. However, and I think this is an important point to try and contextualise this discussion, I think a lot of the material that's written on the subject of Hinduism and women is rather one-dimensional. And in fact it's simplistic, and it's a little too easy, because it's very easy if you're a scholar to go and pick a few books off the shelf and copy down a few quotations and therefore demonstrate this religious tradition is oppressive towards women. I think what you have to look at is the overall context of the position of women in society and the role played by religion within a specific context. First point we have to notice is that up until the modern era, perhaps the 20th century, perhaps the latter half of the 20th century, the view that women were in a sense inferior to men was entirely normative, and we find that across virtually all pre-modern societies there is this view that gender inequality is very much the norm. It's only in modern economic environment where gender equality has suddenly become a major issue. The question then becomes not so much what have religions taught in the past, because I think in virtually all religions we will find evidence of, if not misogyny, then at least the denigration of women. Not so much what do they say in the past, but how much do they apply those ancient teachings to the present situation. In other words, to what extent are religions able to adapt and accept and absorb the value of gender equality, which is normative in modern society. And that's where I think Hinduism is specifically well placed. Now, we mentioned that textual evidence, and particularly the Manusmriti, and that's why I say I think it's unfortunate that work is quoted so often, because it's not enough just to quote a particular text. You also have to ask, what is the authority, what is the status, what is the role played by that text in the practice of the religion? Because a book on its own can't oppress anyone if nobody takes that book seriously. If nobody reads it and follows its instructions, it's not oppressive document. I would think in many ways, therefore, Hinduism is very well placed to adapt to the changing environment of modern economics. One of the main reasons for that would be that textual authority is much looser in Hinduism, so that you've got people like Gandhi saying in the 1920s, I'm not sure if I've got the quote written down here. No, perhaps not. Maybe it's on the section on scripture, which came earlier. But basically what Gandhi is saying is that we don't need to follow these texts. He says, don't think that every word that's called scripture is the word of God. If we find anything in our text which is immoral or opposed to the sense of justice, then we will discard it. And I think the majority of modern Hindus, whether or not they are Gandhiists or followers of Gandhi, would accept that point of view, that if we have a conflict between our sense of justice and morality and the statement of any specific book, then it is the book that must be set aside and not our sense of morality and justice. I've experienced this with discussing this topic with Hindus in classes, etc. I've never come across a single Hindu, I don't think, ever, who, for one thing, ever read the Manusmriti. And when they do it, they invariably ask, what is this book? Who is this Manu? I've never heard of this. Do we have to follow this? And I've read, I remember very clearly one woman who was reading through those passages on the stage of the woman, she simply said, this is a very evil book. And another woman, perhaps a little more light-heartedly, said, this is just some book written by a bloke who was having trouble with his wife. It's not regarded as having any authoritative or binding status, and therefore it seems a little disingenuous to quote this book in a discussion of the contemporary status of women. I think because Hinduism does have that ability to reinterpret its sacred text and indeed discard what might be regarded as sacred text, it's in a particularly good position to to bring in a status of gender equality when the economic, cultural and social circumstances arise that mean that there is pressure for those transformations. Secondly, I think we should look at the teachings of modern Hindus on this very subject and look at the way they've used Hindu ideology to campaign vigorously for gender equality. People like Gandhi, Vivekananda, Dayanand Saraswati, the doyens of modern Hinduism, if you like, they're not saying let's kick out all Hinduism and then we can treat women equally. What they're saying is let's implement the real truth of Hinduism, and then implicitly women will be treated in a better way. And they use different arguments which we could mention briefly. Dayananda Saraswati, for example, argues that if you look to the Vedic scriptures, there is no discrimination against women, and therefore real Hinduism is Vedic Hinduism, and therefore that's the Hinduism we should adopt and follow. And if we follow Vedic Hinduism, then there will be no discrimination against women. I think there's a lot of problems in that. Looking for Vedic Hinduism, I don't know how much of contemporary Hinduism you would have left. But anyway, that's his argument. But significantly, he's not criticising Hinduism. He's not saying we should do away with religion. He's saying we should follow the religion more properly, and proper adherence to Hinduism, which in his view is Vedic Hinduism, means that women are given equal status to men as they were in Vedic times. Let's then look at Swami Vivekananda, another major campaigner on behalf of women in India in the relatively modern era, about 1900. His argument is, just as he argues on caste, that the Vedanta teaches us, and we've seen this when looking at Hindu philosophy, the Vedanta teaches that within every living being there is an identical Atman which is one with Brahman. Therefore, to look at a person and say, oh, she is woman, she is lower, this is a man, he is higher, means that you haven't grasped the principle of Vedanta. Vivekananda talks about constructive Vedanta. He talks about applying Vedantic principles to society as a whole. His view is that every person spiritually is equal, and therefore we should carry that understanding into our day-to-day dealings with other people. That if you really understand the principles of Vedanta, then you will regard every living being, man, woman, high caste, low caste, as being the same. And a quotation I read from Vivekananda where he quotes the Katha Upanishad, and he says something like, paraphrasing here, I shan't rest till I root out this distinction of sex. Is there any sex distinction in the Atman? All we can say, and here he quotes the Katha Upanishad, all we can say is asti, asti, which means third person singular of the verb to be, it is, it is. When we're speaking about the highest truths, we don't say man, woman, we simply say it is. And therefore we should take that, if you like, mystical, transcendentalist understanding, but we must apply it in our day-to-day lives. If we really believe Sarvam Kalavidam Brahma, everything is Brahman, that means that we must therefore treat men and women as equal. So again, he's using a Hindu argument, an understanding of Hindu philosophy, and applying it to gender relations there, and he's using it as a resource to uplift the status of women. And we could, there's a number of different points we could possibly make. I was reading Lina Gupta, another Hindu scholar, who's talking about the goddess tradition in Hinduism, the fact that God in Hinduism isn't a universally male figure, but there is also the notion of the goddess, the supreme deity, and in the Shakta tradition, Durga, Kali, Parvati is the supreme deity. And what she says, therefore, Hinduism is not an inherently patriarchal tradition, and that Hindu women can use the idea of a goddess to improve their own self-confidence and indeed their own social status. Another resource that is available in allowing and in fact propelling Hinduism to adapt to the conditions of modernity which demand a value of gender equality. Also thinking then perhaps of Mahatma Gandhi. What Gandhi's argument is, a rather subtle argument, but his argument is that spirituality, if you like, religiosity, spiritual progress, is encapsulated within the concept of ahimsa. The spiritual person, by dint of his own spirituality, has no sense of harming any other living being. When he comes to apply this to to the position of Indian women. He says that if Indian women are oppressed, suppressed, and not allowed equal rights to men, then that is irreconcilable with the ultimate principle of Hinduism, which is not harming. If I am harming women by ascribing to them a lower status, then I am not reaching the highest level that Hinduism urges me to achieve. Hinduism and the oppression of women are therefore incompatible. And Gandhi therefore argues that any rule such as not allowing widows to remarry, which causes harm to women, doesn't matter how many texts it's written in, it should be put aside, because the highest principle remains not harming. What he's really saying is that if I am truly spiritual, I have no malice, no unkindness, no impetus within my being to harm another living being, and that such a person will never cause any harm to a woman and will never accept any regulation that will harm a woman. I think I've got a quotation here in the book where it says, this is Gandhi, what he writes, "But to remove legal inequalities will be a mere palliative. The root of the evil," and by the evil he means the mistreatment of women, "the root of the evil lies much deeper than most people realise. It lies in man's greed of power and fame." What he means there is then that men oppress women simply because they lack spirituality. And therefore to be, if you like, an advanced Hindu, to fully take on board the principles of Hinduism, means axiomatically that you don't mistreat anyone, man, woman, at all. So to conclude on this issue of gender, there is no doubt that we can find a range of teachings from within the Hindu tradition, from within Hindu texts, that prescribe a role of inferiority for women. The Stri Dharma, the duties of a woman, seem to be situated in that. But this is the case, I think, universally with religion, because the teachings of religion on society reflect the pre-modern environment in which they were formulated. The real question is the capacity of a religious tradition to adapt itself to changing social circumstances, changing economic circumstances, changing cultural values, and indeed the resources that religion can provide the modern adherents for reforming a situation which is today deemed to be iniquitous. And in that sense, I would suggest that Hinduism is particularly well positioned with a range of resources in terms of ideas, values, role models, etc., to adapt and embrace the ideal of gender equality, which is normative in the present day. Okay, thank you.